I are going to be presenting. Oh, okay, great. It's recording now. So Rob and I are going to be presenting about the history of racist land use practices. And as I talked about earlier, racial equity is really central to the work that we do. And this is also, I acknowledge, a topic that can be heavy to talk about. But at the same time, knowledge is power, and it's important to learn about and acknowledge past racist history in this country in order to find ways to move forward together and advocate for change. But I also just want to say that if you feel overwhelmed or triggered at any point in the presentation, please feel free to step away and take a break if you need it. So we're going to start by sharing a video that gives some background information on what land use and zoning is and how it relates to race. So it's a little over 2 minutes in length. Okay.
Zoning is a way for communities to separate land by use or form. For example, an area could be dedicated to commercial or industrial use, or there could be a restriction on how many housing units can be built. Zoning shapes the places where we live, but it also shapes our lives. Local zoning regulations determine where we can find housing, schools, and parks, and who gets to use them. Policymakers initially created zoning codes to protect public health. For example, to stop residents from getting sick from living too close to factories. But from the start, zoning has separated more than just land uses. It has also separated people. In the early 20th century, many communities explicitly used zoning ordinances to racially segregate neighborhoods, effectively declaring that different skin colors were as incompatible as a family's home and a smokestack. By the late 20th century, civil rights legislation outlawed overt housing discrimination, but those explicit racial barriers were quickly replaced by subtler methods. Even today, exclusionary zoning policies that restrict lower cost or higher density housing limit racial and economic diversity and raise housing costs. By driving up housing costs, restrictive zoning can exclude people from equal access to public resources, like schools and parks, and leave lower income workers unable to afford housing close to available jobs. When regions are more economically and racially segregated, everyone loses. Local economies see slower growth, and residents of all races are less upwardly mobile. And finally, despite being created to protect public health, zoning often pushes multifamily buildings closer to highways in areas with higher concentrations of air pollutants. As a result, low-income people and people of color are more likely to live in places that could make them sick. It doesn't have to be this way. When done thoughtfully, zoning can connect people and places, not divide us. Communities across the United States are beginning to re-examine the role of zoning and change the restrictive zoning rules, opening neighborhoods to multifamily housing, walkable densities, and more. For more information and resources, and to find out what other communities are doing.
All right, thank you. Before I continue on with the rest of the presentation, I do want to just pause and ask you all, what did you think of the video? And is this something you've learned about before, or is this totally new? I will move on. So yeah, the video explained that zoning is dividing an area into zones and creating rules for how the land can be used. This is a zoning map of Beaverton. So the different colors represent different zones or different land uses. The yellow, orange, and brown areas, for example, are residential. And until pretty recently, was a lot of this residential land was primarily for single detached houses only. And other types of housing like apartments couldn't be built in a huge, in I'd say apartments, duplexes, and other types of housing couldn't be built in huge portions of the city. So this is an example of how zoning has been used as a tool to create segregation in the city. So, and along with the zoning map, we also have something called a development code. And a development code is the city's land use rules with information about zoning, as well as specific requirements for things like signs, parking, trees, housing, including how big the building can be and what type of housing is allowed. And we also know that from the video, zoning has historically been used as a tool to intentionally segregate people. And I'll get into a little bit more of the history in the next few slides. So I'm going to go through some key points in the history of racist land use and housing practices and how these practices have led to the racial disparities that we see today. This timeline is not at all an inclusive history. There's so much more we could talk about, but this just touches on some of the main practices of the past that resulted in racist outcomes. So the first thing I want to talk about are restrictive covenants, which are restrictions for how land could be used and who could live there. These were written on a deed of a property. Restrictive covenants came about in the mid 1800s and acted as a type of privatized zoning before formal city zoning. So, for example, Beaverton didn't have its first zoning code until the 1960s. This type of zoning was used to segregate people and often contained very racist language. I'm going to show an example on the next page. I do want to give a content warning about racist language. So this is an example of a racist covenant found in the Cedar Hills area, just outside city limits. It reads, "No persons, except persons who shall be of the Caucasian race, shall be allowed to use or occupy said property, except for domestic servants, chauffeurs, or employees." This is from 1946, which is 2 years before the US Supreme Court declared these types of covenants unenforceable. And while this is no longer allowed, it shows that there were certain neighborhoods around Beaverton that only allowed white people to live there. And this continues on throughout history. The next historical practice I want to talk about is redlining, which was common in the 1930s. Redlining is declaring an area hazardous because people of color live there. People in redline neighborhoods were often refused home loans. So this is an example of a redlining map of Portland in 1934. The Homeowners Loan Corporation created maps assigning color grades to different neighborhoods based on how desirable the neighborhood was. So green was labeled as best, blue was still desirable, yellow was definitely declining, and red was considered hazardous. So depending on where you lived, this made it difficult or impossible to get a loan for a home. And red line areas typically had a high number of immigrants and people of color. After World War II, many white families moved from cities to suburbs like Beaverton. Duplexes and apartments became illegal to build in many neighborhoods, as I talked about before. And at the same time, cities did not invest in communities of color. Realtors sometimes didn't sell homes to people of color in white neighborhoods. And freeways were also commonly built through poor neighborhoods with large populations of people of color. So a local example of this is the construction of I-5, which was built right through Northeast Portland in Albina, which is a historically Black neighborhood. Next, I want to talk about, I wanted to bring up gentrification and displacement, which we continue to see today. And a lot of you noted that, you've seen Beaverton start to change. And, with gentrification, oftentimes displacement is associated with that. So these words are related, but they don't mean the same thing. Gentrification is when investments are made to a place that make it less affordable to existing residents. And displacement is when residents or businesses are forced to leave a neighborhood, which is sometimes a result of gentrification, but not always. Rob is going to talk a little bit more about the trends we're seeing today as a result of these actions that disproportionately targeted Black folks and other people of color. So Rob, take it away.
Thank you, Jenna. So as Jenna was talking about, the combined effects of redlining, which again is declaring an area hazardous because people of color live there, and creating exclusive single-family neighborhoods reinforced existing segregation patterns within cities. We also heard Jenna say that people in redline neighborhoods were often refused home loans. In some cases where people of color were approved for home loans, either in a redline neighborhood or in a city without redlining, they did not have access to low-interest mortgage loans that were often reserved for white families only. These practices were compounded by other racist housing practices, such as white construction crews refusing to build housing if they knew people of color might move into them. Collectively, all of these practices reinforced the existing segregation patterns and housing cost burdens across the country, a pattern that has persisted for nearly 100 years. Within Washington County, we know that housing segregation is highest for Latinx residents, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders. We also know that Black and African American segregation has increased, and we know that Black, Latinx, African American, and larger households experience higher rates of housing cost burden. With respect to displacement, studies show that residents who identify as Black, African American, Latinx, those with disabilities, and larger families experience the highest rates of displacement. And we know that home ownership is lowest for the Native American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Hispanic residents within Washington County, followed by Black, African American, and Native American. Next slide, please. To be clear, these housing disparities are the direct result of government-approved racist policies dating back nearly 100 years. But today, many governments are working to reduce these housing disparities by passing more equitable housing laws, drafting new housing plans, establishing new housing projects, and dedicating money to fund new projects and programs. For example, we know that Beaverton created its first diversity, equity, inclusion plan, as Jenna was talking about earlier, followed by a housing 5-year action plan in 2018. Among other things, both documents include policies that aim to promote access to affordable and fair housing and prevent or mitigate displacement in vulnerable neighborhoods. On the following slides, I'll talk more about how new housing laws that have been passed, as well as recent steps to build more regulated, affordable housing. Next slide, please. In 2019, the state passed Senate Bill 608. Before this law was passed, Oregon did not have mandatory rent controls. This meant that landlords could raise rent each year significantly. Restrictive land use practices added to this problem by limiting housing supply, which keeps rents high. State law now only allows landlords to raise rent a limited amount once per year. Next slide, please. The percentage by which a landlord can raise rent changes annually. I think we heard Maria touch upon this earlier, but in 2023, the state deemed that landlords can raise rent 14.6% this year, which admittedly is concerning for many rent-burdened households. To address this ongoing issue, Beaverton provides emergency rental assistance, eviction protection, and resources for affordable housing. And if you have any questions about any of these, you can always ask BMF. Next slide, please. In 2019, the state also passed House Bill 2001. As Jenna was talking about earlier in this presentation, cities made it illegal decades ago to build duplexes and small apartment buildings in areas that were reserved for single-family homes. When cities restricted the ability to build more housing in more places, they not only reinforced the exclusivity of the white single-family neighborhood, but they also restricted the housing supply, which keeps rent high. Now, state law requires that cities allow a range of housing types in all neighborhoods. Over time, more homes in more areas are expected to reduce the pressure on rent, but building enough homes to reduce the pressure on rent could take several decades. Next slide, please. To implement this new law, Beaverton's Housing Options Project created new housing rules that allow duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters in all neighborhoods. Over the last 2 years, the Inclusive Housing Cohort presented critical feedback on this project at 4 or 5 meetings. Next slide, please. Additional city-initiated efforts to address housing needs in the community include the Marianne, a new affordable housing building completed in 2021, which includes 54 units with 2 or more bedrooms for Latinx and low-income families in downtown Beaverton, and also the Cooper Mountain Community Plan, which is a plan that would allow 5,000 new homes, a mix of types, to be built in an area with abundant natural resources. The city's goal is for 10% of these new 5,000 homes to be regulated affordable housing. Next slide. Okay, and that brings us to the reflection. Ernesto, were you going to use a different slide for this?
I don't